Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu filling in for Riz Khan. On Tuesday, Iran said it did not expect to face a third round of UN sanctions over the nuclear issue. For more than 2 years, a defiant Iran has maintained a uranium enrichment program that it says are for purely peaceful purposes. But Western nations fear the enrichment activities are a pathway to Tehran's development of nuclear arms. During his time at the United Nations, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, repeatedly called for sanctions against Iran and now says that U.S. President George W. Bush is betraying his own best instincts and diplomacy is fruitless. John Bolton joins me today. He recently published the memoir, Surrender is Not an Option, Defending America at the United Nations and Abroad. He stepped down from his position as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations in December 2006. He's currently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank here in Washington, D.C. Don't forget, we take your questions and comments on this program. The numbers are there at the bottom of your screen. Ambassador Bolton, thanks for coming in. Thanks for joining us. The book is Surrender is Not an Option, and I see already it's number 15 on the New York Times bestseller list, only 1 week over there, so it's done well already.
Well, so far, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you about the title, Surrender is Not an Option. Are you referring there to the war on terror or a wider struggle?
The opening scene of the book is about the Goldwater for President campaign in 1964, which was my first campaign, and my reaction to the crushing defeat that Goldwater suffered, and how people reacted to it who were involved in the Goldwater campaign. Some gave up in politics, some drifted off to the left. But I concluded that Goldwater's principles had been right and that the battle was worth pursuing. So my conclusion was that surrender was not an option.
Of course, you are best remembered, you will be remembered for your time at the United Nations. You were a strong supporter of the Bush administration's policies at that time and before, but there came a point where you parted ways with the Bush administration. You became a critic of their policies, you opposed them. At what point did that happen?
Well, I think the shift in the policies began during the president's second term, and one reason I decided not to stay at the UN but to allow my recess appointment to expire was my feeling that the policies were moving in the wrong direction, that I had passed the point where I could do much to affect them. And so in the calculus of holding senior political office in the United States, when you cannot in good conscience defend the policies anymore, it's your responsibility to step down, which I did at the end of last year.
What exactly were your differences with the administration?
Well, I think they came over a range of issues: the North Korean nuclear weapons program, the Iranian nuclear weapons program, Middle East policy. So it was, to me, a reflection of a U-turn in the president's foreign policy generally, and one I was disturbed and unhappy by, given that I thought his original direction, beginning with the campaign in the year 2000, had been correct.
Well, tell me, what do you propose should be done about Iran? How should that problem that exists between Iran and the rest of the Western world, rather, be resolved?
Well, I think this is a problem between Iran and the entire rest of the world, given that Iran is violating commitments it made under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty not to seek nuclear weapons. The course that the U.S. has followed over 4+ years, really going on 5, has been to defer to the European Union effort to negotiate Iran out of its nuclear weapons program. But I think Iran's consistent response has been, this is a matter of right to the government of Iran. They're going to continue it. It's only for peaceful purposes. And they strung the Europeans out for a long time during those negotiations, during which Iran perfected the critical uranium conversion technique and the uranium enrichment technique, making it far closer to nuclear weapons than before. So I think our options are limited at this time because of the failure of the European diplomacy.
Limited to just force?
No, I think there are two options, basically. One is regime change in Tehran. We have historical experience, for example, in South Africa, when the apartheid regime fell and a democratic government came into power. The new government concluded that it didn't want to pursue nuclear weapons. I think that's a possibility in Iran as well, and that would be my preferred alternative. I don't think the use of force is at all attractive. I think it's definitely the last resort. But life is about choices, and if the choice is between a nuclear-capable Iran and the targeted use of military force against the nuclear weapons program, I think you have to look at the use of force.
Well, let's look at the European role. In your book, you refer to the reluctance of the European Union to confront and resolve problems, preferring instead what you call continuous diplomatic mastication. Those are the words you use there. But in many instances, diplomacy has worked very well. If you take the case of Libya, they dismantled their nuclear program. Colonel Gaddafi did. If you take it, we're hearing now that North Korea may be doing the same thing, that it's going to agree to allow its nuclear program to be dismantled. So why not more diplomatic mastication?
Well, let's take Libya first. Why did Libya give up its nuclear weapons program? I think three events were critical there, and none of them were diplomatic. The first was the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. Muammar Gaddafi concluded, inaccurately perhaps, but concluded that he might be next, a fate he didn't particularly want to see. Second was the interdiction of the ship, the BBC China, bearing centrifuge equipment from the A.Q. Khan proliferation network, which we uncovered in a fashion consistent with our proliferation security initiative. And when Gaddafi realized that the centrifuge parts were not coming to Tripoli but had been sent somewhere else, he knew that we knew a good deal about his nuclear weapons program. And then the third thing that I think is dispositive was the picture of Saddam Hussein being pulled out of that spider hole near Baghdad in December 2003. So for all of those reasons, Saddam Hussein concluded that he was better off giving up his nuclear weapons program than continuing it. That wasn't the result of diplomacy. That was the result of a very effective anti-proliferation program.
And in the case of North Korea?
Well, I think North Korea is up to its old tricks. You know, North Korea loves to negotiate about giving up its nuclear weapons program, and in the past 15 years it's even agreed 4 or 5 times to do exactly that in exchange for tangible economic and political benefits. The only difficulty is when it comes down to it, North Korea never follows through on its commitment. And right now we have a fascinating question about what exactly North Korea was building in the middle of the Syrian desert by the banks of the Euphrates River that was the subject of an Israeli air raid on September the 6th. This could well be a North Korean effort to outsource its nuclear weapons program. If you're trying to avoid detection by inspectors in North Korea, what better place to build a nuclear facility than in Syria? So we don't know all of the answers about what that facility was, and I think we have to take that in mind. But clearly North Korea not going to give up its program voluntarily.
Although we should say that Syria has denied that it's building some kind of nuclear weapon.
But let me say also, the day after that raid, Syria called for a meeting of the UN Security Council. And I know from my own personal experience, if Syria had wanted to make a fuss in the Security Council about an Israeli attack on an Arab country, they know how to do it. Instead, there's been silence, because I think even the government of Syria would be a little reluctant to go to the Security Council and say, we are outraged that Israel has struck a North Korean nuclear facility on our territory. So unless they have a good story, they really can't go to the Security Council.
Well, they wouldn't be saying that. Let's go to the phones. We have one of our viewers calling from here, right here in Washington, D.C. Basrat, go ahead with your question.
Hi, thank you. Ambassador Bolton, I wanted to ask you about your book. On page 37, you mentioned that you were at a loss when Assistant Secretary of State Jendai Fraser asked you to reopen the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission's final and binding legal decision. And reopening this decision will most certainly result in instability in the region and war. Why was she able to get away with this? And is it U.S. policy to support the Eritrea-Ethiopia boundary decision in public but undermine it in private?
Well, as I say in the book, I don't know why Jendai made that decision. We had been making a pitch in the Security Council to insist that the Boundary Commission and arbitral body's decision be upheld against the wishes of Ethiopia that didn't like the outcome and had been holding it up for 5 years. This was part of my effort in the Security Council to get beyond that European style of negotiation and actually solve some problems, especially in Africa. So when Assistant Secretary Fraser shifted her position, which it was within her responsibility as Assistant Secretary for Africa, it undercut the argument why we were in the Security Council in the first place. And I still don't know the answer to the question, but I do know that the standoff over that border continues to this day.
Let's look now at the whole Iraqi invasion, the war in Iraq. You were at the center of the Bush administration for many years while that was taking place. Do you believe now that it was a mistake?
Oh, absolutely not. I think it was a clear strategic victory for the United States and its friends and allies in the region, Arab as well as Israeli. Saddam Hussein was a threat. He was someone who had a demonstrated propensity to use weapons of mass destruction, as he had against Iran, as he had against the Kurds in his own country. So I don't have any doubt overthrowing him was the right thing to do. I think in the years since we've learned a lesson. My own hindsight view of what we should have done after overthrowing Saddam was to have turned authority over to Iraqis more quickly and to say to them basically now you make the political decisions rather than set up the coalition provisional authority. But as to the decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein, unquestionably correct in my view.
Admittedly, you overthrew a dictator, but Iraq is now widely seen in many parts of the world as a failed state and a haven for terrorists. Still a good decision?
I think America's strategic interest was to prevent Saddam's regime from reacquiring weapons of mass destruction, and we unquestionably achieved that objective. As to what's gone on since then, right now we are engaged in a war there against al-Qaeda in Iraq, and many, many Iraqis are fighting that war with us, as recent events demonstrate, I think, with increasing success. Unfortunately, there are other Iraqis who are fighting other wars, some of them inconsistent with the war on terrorism. And this kind of score settling, while perhaps understandable, is not leading to the creation of a civil society. Ultimately, the Iraqis are going to have to decide this themselves. The United States, no one else can impose it on them from the outside.
Let's go back to the phones. We have a caller from Paris, Anwar in Paris. Anwar, go ahead with your call.
Thank you, Anand. I would like to, Mr. Ambassador, we are talking about various issues in Middle East and other parts, but I have got a different kind of questions for you. We are talking about these days about climate change, and climate situation is one of the main concerns for every country. But another thing for us, human population increase around the world. We strongly believe it's another problem like climate change. Have you given any thought? At this moment, it's 6 billion. It will be increased rapidly if we don't think or do something about that. What's your opinion about that, and what's the solution according to you?
All right, thanks, Anwar. Thanks for your question.
Well, actually, the rate of population increase worldwide has been slowing down, and I think the pattern in countries as they modernize and industrialize is that the birth rate falls, with or without birth control. That's certainly been the pattern in the United States, Western Europe, Japan, Latin America. So I think the answer to the overpopulation question is economic growth, because I think it brings with it incentives for families to limit family size. So I don't really see population growth as the crisis that some did 20 or 30 years ago.
You know, you've been very, very critical of the United Nations before, during, and after your the time you served as ambassador at the United Nations. You once said, very famously, some might say very notoriously, that you could remove 10 floors of the United Nations headquarters in New York and nothing would change. That was interpreted in a number of ways. What did you mean?
Well, it's a metaphor for government. Its point is that no government, no intergovernmental organization would lose much by becoming smaller and more efficient. I mean, there are plenty of buildings in Washington filled with American cabinet departments that could stand to lose a few floors too.
What exactly would you like to see changed at the United Nations? I mean, I was reading a book, and some of it's pretty basic stuff. I mean, you say the organization's too formal, for one. You'd like meetings to start on time. I mean, there are things as basic.
How's that for revolutionary thinking?
Well, that's very basic stuff you're talking about, right?
Well, I think the most important change would be to have member governments make their contributions voluntarily. The most effective, the most efficient, the most transparent UN organizations are ones that are already primarily funded by voluntary contributions. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNICEF, the World Food Program. It's the bodies that rely on assessed contributions that are, I think, among the least effective. And because the United States contributes 22%, 27% of the cost of peacekeeping, I think our contribution is viewed as kind of an entitlement, and it breeds a pattern of dependency. So if people couldn't count on that 22%, if the U.S. could pay for what it wanted and expect to get what it paid for, and so would all the other countries, I think you'd have a much stronger incentive to perform, to actually accomplish something rather than continue the present pattern.
Okay, I want to get in an email. This came from Mr. M.N. Baig of Alberta in Canada, and he says, the Bush administration's foreign policy has brought nothing but chaos, misery and death to thousands of innocent people in Afghanistan, Iraq and other places. After losing in Iraq, the Bush administration is using the same strategies with Iran, false pretense of an atomic bomb program.
Well, let's start with Afghanistan. This was ruled by one of the most fanatical regimes anywhere in the world. And for half of its population, the female half, there was no chance of education, even learning basic literacy skills. This was a regime that destroyed historical treasures that recognized around the world the Bamiyan Buddhas and other icons of ancient history, and oppressed its people across the board. The Afghan people now have a chance to live a free life. The war against the Taliban continues, but Hamid Karzai is viewed around the world as a leader who can help Afghanistan return to coming into the 21st century. In Iraq, certainly the experience has not been totally happy, but you can see now, as Iraqis begun to come back into the country, the prospect of political stability and self-rule. And it will be something, I think, in America will never be forgotten. The pictures of those people voting, but holding their fingers up with the purple ink stain on them to show that they had voted, a very proud moment for the Iraqi people, and something I think people all over the world aspire to.
We have literally 20 seconds left. What do you see as the next biggest threats to world stability?
I think it's the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, or biological, in the hands of rogue states like Iran or North Korea, or falling into the hands of terrorist groups. That's the real issue that confronts us all.
Ambassador Bolton, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The book is Surrender is Not an Option, Defending America at the United Nations and Abroad. And thank you for being with us. On tomorrow's show, we revisit an interview Riz did with South Africa's cleric and Nobel Peace Prize winner Archbishop Desmond Tutu. In the meantime, check out our question of the week at aljazeera.net/English. We ask whether or not protesting is still relevant. We are particularly interested in getting your thoughts by video mail. See you next time. Street Talk is next.